Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. This podcast hosts conversations inspired by and hopefully inspiring towards psychedelic experiences. Many of the episodes do directly address and speak to psychedelics in some length or another, some of which not so much, but the content always interconnects with an underlying question, an underlying wondering about how it is that we can live a life inspired by the lessons psychedelics can offer us insofar as becoming better people for ourselves, for our relationships, and for the world. And in that respect, many episodes are about things that don't appear to be about psychedelics, but do absolutely contribute to the mindset context within which our psychedelic lessons are revealed to us. And the enigmatic nature of that statement aside, welcome. Today's episode is with Jesso Gould, the founder and CEO of the Heroic Hearts Project. And it is going to be about using or working with ayahuasca as a way to heal the trauma military veterans experience as a consequence of wartime or wartime experiences. As a heads up, before I read you the overture, it's about trauma and the military, and we talk about suicide as well. So this one might be a bit of a heavy listen. If you're not in the space to hear that kind of information, you might want to save this for a later day. But that content warning aside, here is the overture to this episode. Starting out with two questions. Can ayahuasca heal the severe PTSD experienced by some military veterans? What impact does ayahuasca healing have on a veteran's relationship to military politics and those politics' impact on the world? As for the first question, apparently yes. There's a growing number of stories emerging from veterans who found relief from the post-traumatic stress disorder they developed due to their military service, many of which sadly reaching to ayahuasca as a consequence of nothing else being able to help them. As for the second question about the impacts of ayahuasca healing on a veteran's relationship to military politics, well, that's a bit more complicating. Thankfully, we have Jesso Gould on the show to explore both of these questions. Jesso is the CEO and founder of the Heroic Hearts Project, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that helps veterans who are interested in pursuing psychedelic treatment options through connecting them with reputable ayahuasca retreat centers. Their program is designed to ensure veterans get the most out of this valuable opportunity and are set up for success when they return home. And they also provide, Heroic Hearts financial scholarships to veterans who are struggling financially. To date, they have provided more than $200,000 in support to veteran applicants. Jesso Gould himself started the Heroic Hearts Project back in 2017 to spearhead acceptance and use of ayahuasca therapy as a means of addressing the current mental health crisis amongst veterans, a cause he is called to as a consequence of his own experience of PTSD after having been deployed as an Army Ranger in Afghanistan 3 times and finding profound healing from that PTSD through ayahuasca. Jesso is on the show to talk about his battle with PTSD and his recovery from ayahuasca therapy. We also talk about the challenges of integrating back into civilian life after combat, the tragic mental health and suicide statistics amongst veterans, and the role Heroic Hearts Project is playing in helping those veterans. More than that, though, and in reference back to that second question about politics, Jesso and I speak about what it's like as a soldier to find out that their government lied to justify the war they were traumatized by being in. We also talk about the impact of military expansionism on the climate crisis, whether or not the, quote, psychedelic cure, end quote, and not Jesse's quote, but sort of a reference to sort of the growing narrative that that psychedelics are being packaged in the mainstream right now, whether or not the, quote, psychedelic cure will be used by governments to justify continuing war, and whether or not ayahuasca healing has any noticeable effects on one's political stance on the military. So this episode is coming out at a bit of a loaded time, obviously, because we just had Remembrance Day about a week ago, and the world is also watching the sort of unfortunate fallout consequences in Afghanistan after President Biden has removed American troops from that country. And my perspective on that is aside. I'm not sharing my perspective here. I'm just bringing up that is the context in which we are going to be discussing the military politics, the severe mental health crisis that veterans are experiencing, and a number of other issues that are obviously wrapped up in that whole thing. But to add to that, I want to tell you that this episode was actually recorded in February of 2021. So it's not like on the button relevant. It's several months old, and the content comes from wherever things were at back in February of 2021. So all that sort of laid out for you. Before we get into the interview, I want to give a big thanks to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description to this episode, wherever you're checking it out. Those people give significantly, some of which for a long time, and they, along with all of my patrons, are the way in which I am able to dedicate myself full time to something I deeply care about, which is psychedelics, psychedelic culture, and contributing to the ongoing social learning process of integrating psychedelics back into our lives and into our society in a generative, healthy way. And so thank you, patrons. Okay, so now here we are. Let's get into this episode, this interview with Jesso Gould, episode 154 on Adventures Through the Mind. Enjoy. Well, my first couple questions are basically like, what is Heroic Hearts? What's it all about? How did you come to create the organization? So, so as a way to lay the foundation of the conversation, maybe then just give us a lay of the land insofar as what is Heroic Hearts and what it's all about.
Okay, perfect.
And we're
should I start now?
And we're recording. We're go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for having me. Heroic Hearts Project is a nonprofit started in the U.S. About 4 years ago, and the main purpose, I guess, can be summarized in three tenets. One, educate. That's educate veterans, military veterans, and the rest of the population about psychedelic therapy, psychedelic ceremonies, including the traditions, including the power, including the therapeutic use of all these substances that often have a lot of stigma attached. Number two is facilitate. Sort of our main core operations is there's a lot of veterans in the US and Canada and the UK, around the world, that are struggling with severe mental health issues. A lot of the suicide rate among the veteran population is well above the general population, and it's really having a devastating blow to the community. And so, while it is so restricted in terms of going to psilocybin, going into ayahuasca ceremonies within the US and some of these other countries, there is the legal ability for people to do it in South America, Central America, some other countries. And so we try to connect veterans to places that the veteran will feel comfortable, they'll be safe. The centers have been, operating for years and years and have a great track record and are sustainable and protect the culture, protect the tradition around this. And so we provide sort of the whole container around that in terms of our main operations: integration support before and afterwards, financial grants, preparation. And so then the third and last tenet would be research. So while we are working with veterans, and one of the ways to change minds and change the stigma is to do our part to track the results as much as possible. One, so that we can do our job better, but two, to add to the literature, add to the discussion. And so we've been fortunate enough to work with a few universities. We're working on some of our own independent studies. The main focus has been ayahuasca, but we have worked with other substances and are looking to branch out as well, just to provide as many tools as possible that can be healing for the veteran community.
Okay, so then what I'm understanding here is that Heroic Hearts is an organization that is helping to bring psychedelic therapy, psychedelic medicine to the veteran community as a way of addressing severe mental health issues inside the community, and obviously for the individuals within it. Um, and so oh man, you gave me such a very clear and like concise answer there that I'm like, oh, you just answered all the questions I had coming up. I'm slightly disoriented. So maybe okay. There's two questions sort of floating around here, and I mean maybe they are answered in the same way or with the same thing. I'm not sure. But one question is, what is it about the context of a veteran returning from war, from their time in the military, that creates such significant problems for their mental health that leads them to needing an organization like Heroic Hearts to step in to be like, hey, this is a thing that's actually working because other things aren't working. Okay. So that's one question.
Yeah.
But then another question is, how is it that you got into this situation? And so that's why I'm like, which one makes sense to start with? Or do they support each other? So I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll just establish the baseline, because I mean, what we're seeing, and not just in the veteran community, but internationally, is a mental health crisis, and it's only getting worse. And we see that is definitely enhanced during the COVID times, but it was already starting to be, something that we have to contend with the new internet age, with social media age. Mental health is becoming more and more of a focal point. And there's whole industries in terms of selling pharmaceuticals and selling retreats, selling wellness sort of packages. And some are better than others, but a lot of it is based off of a very, I think, basic and incomplete understanding of mental health. And so sort of the protocol right now, and you see this throughout the VA, the Department of Veteran Affairs, is a heavy reliance on pharmaceutical medication. So depressants, anti-anxieties, those are very those drugs sell a tremendous amount every year, and with the addition of talk therapy. And I'm not trying to demonize them. They do have an effect and they can save lives. But what I found myself in my own personal journey was that there was just a very limited amount of understanding and options for people trying to be healthier in their day-to-day life. And a lot of times, and we'll get into this a little bit, we tend to box symptoms into, you have PTSD, you have depression, without understanding sort of the whole complexity and multi-layers of what that could actually entail. And so with the case with veterans, is what I believe is that they tend to go to two extreme different worlds. And so they tend to experience a lot of these mental health issues on a much more regular basis, or a much higher percentage basis. So if you view it like a veteran, especially one that was deployed, they're in this very extreme environment where life and death is on the line. They kind of have to come to terms with the fact that they could die, their buddy next to them could die. It's just a constant heightened stress situation where your cortisol levels are at these high levels in a sort of unusual amount of time. And just even in terms of the training, it's just all very intense, very hard on your body. You're exposed to all sorts of different things. And then you go into sort of specific trauma. If you see things, those can have a lot of the lasting effects,
or do things. Of course, like there's lots of from what I understand, there are lots of moments where soldiers will do what they're told to do, and then find out afterwards that like it didn't go as planned. And regardless of having been doing what you were told to do, accidentally murdering a child or blowing up a family home or basically committing something very atrocious, even though it was what was needed to be done at the moment, or an accident as a part of doing what you're doing, that also are things that people who are in the military have to grapple with. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, if you look at, and there's a lot of cases historically through it, there's no reason to kind of skirt around that fact. Like when the whole concept of war is a big dynamic of chaos, and you're putting, it's this ball of violence, and you can't control every factor. So even if every soldier wanted to do, the exact right course, and just even find somebody, arrest them, or what have you, the collateral damage, as it's kind of unemotionally called, is sort of a factor of it. And a lot of stuff happens, and you've seen that time and time again. So yes, that is definitely part of it. And just sort of the sheer act of potentially killing another person, or what have you. For some people, different people have different abilities to cope with that. Other people, it can have, we all have a spectrum of our ability to cope with that. And so, you have to get, that is a very extreme situation, extreme world for these people. And you can train, and it does help in terms of dealing with that and reacting to certain sort of things. But there is a lot of unnatural state to it. But then this person goes into almost a polar opposite world, where a lot of them will find, a corporate job like myself, or they'll just be surrounded by people who, especially in the US or Canada, we are fortunate to live in societies that we don't have a lot of strife. We are very comfortable, relatively speaking. Mm-hmm. And so that does lead to some people maybe not necessarily understanding that that's not the world outside of that as well. Like there's a lot of other hardships and all this other kind of stuff. So it can just sort of lead to veterans feeling very isolated. They tend to, all of a sudden have a lack of purpose because they weren't doing the same sort of job. They might just be, in a cubicle. They oftentimes lose their sort of brotherhood, sisterhood of these people that they got really close to. And then you have the added component of all these sort of mental health issues that either have been compartmentalized or building up through their lives. And so you have, and that's sort of my hypothesis of why veterans tend to have a lot of these issues on a much higher level than you might find, generally speaking, in society, because they are coming from these two, it's almost like going from a hot shower to the cold bath. It can be a complete shock to the system. And while there's a lot of programs to make somebody a soldier, to indoctrinate them into being a soldier, there aren't ceremonial or training practices that make them a civilian again. And so you have a lot of these veterans that tend to be almost like 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And mixed with the complication of post-traumatic stress disorder, which, people like Bessel van der Kolk would report as being in some sense a memory disorder, where the extremes of their life deployed in active wartime is now like continues over in moments as though they are still in it, but everything is peaceful, and the incongruence between what's happening within and what's happening without is extremely stressful on a person, on their mind, on their identity, on their ability to actually receive the nourishment of being back in civilian life, back in relative safety, back with friends and family and loved ones. And so I can imagine that too. I wonder about, like, you just made a point, one of the comments I wrote down from our conversation was that, the military, like you said, helps people, it's really good at indoctrinating people into soldiers, but not very good to welcome them back into civilian life. And so you perhaps end up stuck back there in a way that even, without the tools you had to survive there, now you're back and it's all stuck in you and you're stuck in it. I mean, I'm just kind of going off. I don't know the veterans' experience and I'm really aware of that. So I'm kind of saying it out loud, wondering, and like as an invitation for you to give me feedback.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I definitely agree on how you phrase that. And that's kind of my own perspective on the world and in general, is that, and I think it's on a few different levels. So I feel like they're not ready to become civilian on the mental and possibly spiritual level, but then also they are held up on possibly a physical level. And so like a lot of the training and situations, there is a lot of evidence that it almost might keep certain parts of the brain at hyperdrive. So hypervigilance is a common thing in veterans, and just having those high cortisol levels for so long affects your brain chemistry. Then you add on potential traumatic brain injury from concussive force, from head trauma, and so you're already having these brains that I feel like are physically and chemically altered from the experience, which is, makes even the healthiest person going to have a lot of hardships and a lot of barriers. But then I think you also have, sort of this personal, spiritual, almost turning of the chapter. And I think just in Western society, apart from the military, this is something that our culture severely lacks. Is if you look at all these indigenous cultures and historic villages and people and all that kind of stuff, that they really have ceremonies, they have this community, they have these rituals to designate when we change aspects of our life, whether it's becoming, an adult, becoming a man, becoming a woman, much more, community-based marriage ceremony. And even a lot of these tribal societies had ceremonies when the warriors would come back from war, whether it's, taking off the bad energy or allowing them to get back into sort of the communal setting. And we just don't have that. And it's kind of more of like, okay, you're done with your contract. Your contract's up. It's expired. And so go forth. But you have to also realize how much time is spent making a person into a soldier. And because in order for survival, a soldier has to be able to work with the group. They have to be able to react to the situation in the moment, not even thinking, almost it being muscle memory with, hundreds or dozens of other people. And that takes a lot of training. That takes a lot of, changing your mind, but there's nothing to sort of release you back into being a civilian or change you into being, I guess you can never go back exactly where you were, but to what's the next level of you? How do you better embrace the society that's going forward?
And so how did that show up for you? How did that show up for you? This is, I'm sort of like asking you for your story with a beginning, middle, and ending to basically where we are now, but obviously not all the details, but how did that happen for you? How did you get to ayahuasca? What was it about ayahuasca? And to the degree to which you're willing sharing, what is it in particular that it helped you resolve? And then how did that impact your ability to show up back into the rest of your life? Obviously well enough to want to create this entire organization, but specifically, like, what is the story? What was the trauma you showed up with? How did you get to ayahuasca? How and what did it heal for you? And what was the result in your life afterwards?
Yeah, of course. And to give people some context, so I was a Army Ranger. So in the U.S., Ranger is a special operations group within the Army, much more direct action sort of engagements. And I had 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan. And overall through my career, generally speaking, I was pretty lucky to avoid any sort of serious events that, in the moment you're like, oh, this is going to mess me up. Fortunately, I wasn't, in sort of these like Hollywood moments where everything's going wrong and people are dying left and right. But no matter what, like within the context of that, there were people I knew that died in combat, and there was just sort of that existential threat when you're there and the heightened stress levels and all that kind of stuff. But when I was leaving the military, I felt pretty good, like having gone through, some of the toughest like training and selections. And I had a background already in finance. And so I was very confident of like, hey, I'm ready to charge at this world. I'm ready to go on to bigger and better things. And because I feel like I didn't have that, specific moment where I'm like, oh, this is going to cause me PTSD, I didn't feel like I was in that category. And that's actually pretty common for a lot of veterans. And so I think because of that and because of that sort of bravado coming out of it, I tended to ignore it much longer than I should have. Mm-hmm. But I think that's also, the challenge of mental health in terms of having conversations. It's not really still taboo in certain circles. And so I went back into eventually finance. I was in corporate finance. And so I kind of mentioned that before. I was like, okay, well, this is a great next step. And, I can kind of prove my chops here and have a great job, get paid, do the good life thing. And at first it was going good. And I established on the outside, everything was going good. I had the green check marks on all the boxes of what I should be doing and that successful life. But as my life slowed down, I think especially from the Ranger side of it, where it's high octane all the time, it was there's less distraction for me to avoid some of the things that were bubbling up under the surface. And, as life kind of got into that routine where it's like the 9 to 5 and you're going there and then you meet the same people on the weekend, all that kind of stuff, that's when it started really coming about and really started being troubling. Unfortunately, I had some red flags. And for me, it really manifested in, just very heightened anxiety, sometimes going into panic attacks where I had to miss work. That would like go into depression where it just be in the state where everything was gray and, and also it subjected me to putting myself into dangerous situations, either when I was in Florida or when I was like traveling, of just needlessly putting myself at risk. And also just a lot of drinking to kind of, I guess, drown it out, ignore it, continue that. And so I just found myself in this spot where I was just very unhealthy.
This is a very personal question, so you could just refuse it. But I know one of the sort of reported sort of events for people, veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, are violent episodes. And I'm wondering, like, did anything like that happen for you? Did you feel at any point violent episodes upon oneself? Suicide obviously is a violent episode by which somebody dies of mental health crisis or of depression, but against others. Did you happen to notice any moments where, from a violent standpoint, you were fearful for yourself or for the safety of your loved ones while you were suffering from this?
No, fortunately for me, that's not, everybody has different, personalities and different sort of energies inside of themselves. And I've never really been excessively angry or in terms of violent being my first response. I think mine is kind of more of an isolation, but, I would get into, I guess you could kind of classify this, which is a pretty common thing among veterans and relates to what I was saying, is that you have this sort of death by putting yourself in these situations. So it's not, you're not there to like suicide, but I've had a few friends that, got into bad motorcycle wrecks because they're going 100 miles plus on the highway and just going around curves and stuff like that. That's pretty common. And so I did find myself in those sort of situations where, maybe just, needlessly going fast on a motorcycle or what have you. So those are those sort of situations. But for me, it's just kind of more, fortunately, never to the suicide spot, but definitely very nihilistic, like, why does it matter? Like, who cares kind of sort of spots, which is, in itself, very scary spot to be in. Because if you're stopped caring, then you're not taking care of yourself. And then those sort of lead to, I think, sort of the degradation of your community, your friends, family, because you start pushing them off, or, even if it's not a violent reaction, you might react to them in some sort of way or embarrass yourself or what have you.
It slowly degrades sort of the quality of your relationships and thus sort of the mental health quality of everyone who you're connected to and cares for you.
Exactly. And it only, the thing with life, and especially with all this, is it only takes like one big mistake or a few different mistakes, and it can permanently alter your life. And that's where I was starting to see, the red flags pop up of like, hey, I've been actually pretty lucky in some of these situations. But, I can't just, eventually it's going to catch up with me. And that became more and more clear that something was going to catch up with me. Like whatever the trajectory I was going on was not a path towards success. It was a path towards doing something stupid, going a little bit too far, and affecting my life or even worse, somebody else's life. And, possibly somebody I care about. And so I just got into that sort of spot, and I started pursuing, little by little. I was like, okay, well, let's first get into shape. Let's first eat healthier. Let's first learn a hobby, and let's see if we can do some of this stuff. I started journaling, meditating, and it did help, but it always just kind of hit the same wall. Eventually I went to the Department of Veteran Affairs. I was like, okay, well, at least let me talk to a therapist. I'm not qualified to do this. I don't know what's going on. I don't think I have PTSD, but who knows? So I went to the VA, and then unfortunately hit another wall. It was really, they essentially said, hey, unless you're willing to take medication, we can give you a few therapy sessions, but unless you're willing to do the full board of it, there's only so much we can help. And I'm like, That doesn't seem right, but I guess that's what this situation is. And so that's where I found myself in a situation where I was just like, there has to be other options out here.
So let me take a
And
let me take a pause here so I can get a little lay of the land, right? So you come back from you come back from you end your service with the military. You go back into regular life. And from what I understand, there's sort of the marketing around entering the military is like, come serve your country so that, and your country serves you, like we welcome and we appreciate our soldiers and whatever. But then when you come back, you're the kind of care you get, which is like, either you do exactly what we're going to tell you to do, or we basically give you nothing. Tough luck. Sorry. See ya. Is that kind of the energy of the type of like post-military service caring that veterans are receiving in the United States?
It's tricky. So like if you go to the VA there's always been ups and downs, but like let's say right now, if you go there for surgery, if you go there for general health care and stuff like that, it's a great place to go, and they've definitely improved over the past 10, 20 years. And so I've had a lot of friends that had surgeries and they had nothing but great things to say. The employees at the VA, they all tend to be, fantastic and really actually care about the veterans. But at a certain level, the VA in the US especially is just this huge bureaucratic giant. And so it might not be intentional, but it just ends up happening like that, where it's a very slow object to change. And even when they do try to change, so there's been a lot of initiatives to improve the mental health. But then oftentimes when you have these quotas and these other systems of how do you measure that, it tends to not be the best way for actually helping veterans. And so it is definitely a systematic issue, and that would take a lot of understanding and conversations to figure out exactly where the point of systematic failure is. But there definitely is, at some level, I believe, a systematic failure in the mental health care. And it's the numbers prove that out. In the US, they just released a report. The last 5 years, the suicide rate has only increased from the VA. And this is after billions and billions of dollars of initiatives. And this suicide epidemic has been going on for the past 20 years. So it's not like a new thing. So if you just look at that, then obviously there is a failure. Where it is, that's a very complicated issue. But, there are people that do want to help. I think it's just our attention span so short that we think, okay, well, they got another $1 billion, that should probably help it. But there needs to be, I think, a little bit more in-depth conversation there.
Interesting. Okay, so then how did you get to ayahuasca? And maybe or maybe not, you want to share your ayahuasca story. I don't know if you feel like it's relevant, but what is it? How did you get there, and what is it that you found that it offered you? And in particular, I'd be curious about what it is within the experience. What did you face and address within the experience that led you to obviously the more positive side, the more positive disposition on the other side?
Yeah, of course. And so I was there in Tampa, Florida. I was working at the job, and I just found myself miserable. And it was just starting, like, the formula is changing of like more days were unhappy than happy. And it was just like, I don't know what's going on. Something needs to change. Like, there's no help on the outside. So I have to figure this out. Around the same time, I guess happenstance, or if you go deeper into the sort of medicine work, it all kind of works out when it should. Ayahuasca came across my radar, through a podcast, as it's been gaining a little bit more prominence in the Western society. I first heard about it and I just kind of cast it off. I never had a psychedelic experience, and I never really considered myself interested in it. That wasn't part of how I defined myself. Didn't have any issue with anybody doing it, but I was just like, I'm not a person that takes psychedelics. Mm-hmm. But it kind of for whatever reason, it planted a seed. And the more I, looked into it, the more I read about it, the more, I guess, it started to intrigue me and started opening up the cracks of where, like, okay, maybe I could see myself doing this. And I think the thing that allowed me to get there was that it just didn't seem recreational like I kind of viewed other psychedelics. It seemed to have this rich cultural history and tradition around it. And I already had I've lived in South America before, and so I already was I already liked the culture and could see myself going back. And so that's just started to evolve. And it just eventually came to a spot of like, hey, I know I'm miserable in my job. I know that has to change. Tampa's not really doing anything for me. I'm just in a very unhealthy situation. So let's change the script. Let's just kind of shake it up a little bit and try again. Because whatever this try was, it's leading me down a bad path. So I just kind of took that leap of faith at that point. It was really following intuition. At that point, I really wouldn't be able to explain it to anybody, but it was just a strong feeling of like, this is the next step for me. This is what I have to do. I'll figure it out on the way. So fortunately, I went there, did research, found a spot that I was comfortable with that appealed to me. It was in Iquitos, Peru. And, still going in skeptical of like, what am I doing? I've never done psychedelics, so straight to ayahuasca, plunging in. And my first 2 ceremonies when I was there was over the course of the week, 4 ceremonies over that course. It was, super intense, very physical, all out war. The second one especially was just the continuation of the first and just very demanding and made me like fear for my sanity, just pushed me to the edge on all levels where just uncomfortable, vomiting throughout the night, hot, suffocating, intense shapes, sizes, nothing really to like write down, but just exhausting experience through the end of like what's going on. But I stuck with it. And, for me, it's never really been about like some necessarily a profound image or whatever, but it's more of the, I guess, ways it kind of teaches for me, it's always almost been more of a exercising certain parts of my brain. And so I'll explain that a little bit where, like I said, it was this all out war, super intense. And I was just like, why can't I just let go? Why can't I, go into it? And eventually, in my experience, a hand reached out to me and almost pulled me. And then instantaneously, I was in this sort of calm, serene spot, felt the cold breeze on my face, physiologically changed in an instant. But then, as our minds do, I had that sort of second guessing of like, but what if I go back there? The moment that happened, I just flew right back into, the mess, the war, the chaos. And so over the next 2 ceremonies is sort of this practice is how I view it is almost building that muscle in my brain to allow myself to be in this calm spot. Like I don't need to suffer. I don't need to put myself through this. And so eventually I was able to sort of stay there and just not, second guess and not fall into that sort of hole. And that, for whatever reason, that was one of the things that later I found really helped me. Whatever I learned during that ceremony helped me with my anxiety, where what happens with a lot of these issues, anxiety, depression, anger, is they're almost like vortexes or whirlpools. Like when you're on the edge, if you can recognize it right there, sometimes you can kind of like sidestep it and avoid it. But like the moment you start falling in, you just go deeper and deeper and deeper. And so with anxiety, like you're already in this agitated state, and then your brain starts bringing in more and more stuff about like, oh, and you're late on this. Oh, and you're not good at this. Oh, blah, blah, blah. You just get deeper and deeper. And so whatever I learned through that session allowed me to almost like see where the vortex was and sidestep it when it was coming.
Mm. Mm. I have a series of like pointed questions that I have about the military and your thoughts on things now.
Okay.
But I think I'd like I'd be curious to hear I'd be curious to hear a case study. So you've been helping to advocate for and facilitate veterans to have ayahuasca experience. Obviously, right now, pandemic, that's all complicated. But you managed to bring quite a number of people through this experience. Obviously, it has been going very well for the most part, or else your organization, would have already ended. So. Right. I'm wondering if you could share, the story of somebody who, I mean, obviously there's a degree of privacy that you would want to respect, and I can understand if you don't have any stories to tell. But I'm curious if you have the story of sort of the most significant transformation you saw with one of the people that you brought out, and what it was that helped them. like what it is that they face and how the ayahuasca experience helped them.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of stories, and from the whole spectrum of people able to come off medication beforehand and being able to stay off medication, which was in some ways ruining their lives. People who had suicidal ideation, who instantly realized sort of the flaw of that, and never returning to that to date, and just living happy lives. One of the more poignant stories, because I was there and seeing it and having these experiences one-on-one, helps me like revitalize me after the uphill battle that is a nonprofit.
Right.
And so it was one guy, and he was special forces, which is kind of commonly known Green Beret in the US. And he's like this big, like a large guy, came there. This was in Costa Rica, just man a few words and just like a very intimidating presence. And you can tell he's like, what am I doing here? Why am I here? And he had a very long, extensive career doing all sorts of stuff, and went there, and to his credit, went full on, like took on the whole ceremony, did everything as they suggested. And over the course of that week, he almost changed. We were like joking with him, just like he almost turned into like a hippie while we're there. And not in a bad way. And like he was still the core of himself, and not in any sort of like he's like super far out there. But he became more of like, oh, I was talking to my stomach today, and it told me that I should be eating better. And he was just much more connected, and you can see he was just lighter and happier, and like just his energy or his personality like immediately changed. And he still helps out with the organization to date, and just tells his story. And really, given his background, his resume, so to speak, it really has a lot of weight. And then just in terms of how he changed. And so, months afterwards, we were talking, and he was just telling me this great story where he was back at home with his family, and he has like a 10-year-old son. And so his son had only known him in the military. So the son's whole perspective was this like military, by the book, like straight laced kind of person. And so then he was just telling me a story of like this one morning they're like making pancakes, and normally he'd be like rushing through it and trying to get the kid to go on the bus to get to school and all this other kind of stuff. And this was the first time that he was like, laughing with his son and just enjoying it, and not worried about like making the bus on time, because it was like, oh, we'll make another bus, or I'll just drive him, or what have you. And he was just telling him like how much he really enjoyed just that moment, and it was just love all around it. And the kid was also like, what happened to you in the jungle? Like what happened to this person? But I mean, that's the beauty to me, because it's healing, just as trauma can be, healing can also be such a cross-generational sort of issue. And it can really change lives multi-generations down the line. And you see that, children of people with PTSD often tend to have some of their own severe issues, and it just kind of gets passed on. And so that's the important of the work, is it does have this almost exponential effect. Is not only it affects the individual, but it can affect the whole family, the community. Who knows, what kind of good work that they might do if they're not burdened by the darkness, or by, just whatever is suppressing them. And so those are the stories that, really keep on inspiring the work, because you can kind of see that this is having a much bigger effect than even just the individual.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move on to some of these pointed questions, which I admit in advance will be very apparent that they are also statements of my opinion formed as a question to get your comments, criticisms, disagreements, agreements, etc. And the first is something like this. Viktor Frankl, as I assume that you would be familiar with Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. He, a person who was a part of the Nazi concentration camps, a Jewish person, part of the Nazi concentration camps, comes out, writes this book, and says, like, with a sufficient sense of meaning, like one can endure almost anything. And I imagine that a core sense of the meaning that allows one to endure wartime as a soldier, as a military person. The difficulties of returning, as we've discussed it, that sort of exists. We'll set that aside for a second. I'm thinking about something specific. The meaning of that is to serve your country, the United States of America, to help bring peace and stability, democracy, whatever it is, these rhetorics. And yet presently it seems almost impossible to deny, based on the information we have available, widely available, that the United States military for the last many decades has not exactly been operating with that type of nobility. There has been a lot of wars that have been started on false terms, for example, or ultimately were less about safety and stability and democracy and more about economic control, resource dominance, based in deception, and ultimately deception of the people, that the soldiers that they have come in and now commit, be a part of, be subject to atrocities and violence to serve a country that is lying to them and lying to everyone else, that is concerned more about dominance than it is about its own expressed mandate. So my question is, given that, and given how much pain you've seen people come out on the other side of their military service, what are your thoughts on this? And how do you see that sort of disenchantment playing out in people coming back from the military? Do you see that? Is that there? And just generally your comments or criticisms of my statement there?
No, I mean, I think, like you said, you have a lot of very valid points, and the majority of it can be backed up by even, the military's own admission. I think there's like the recent thing in the past year that they didn't have a plan for Afghanistan, and, them saying that they did was actually a fabrication. And so there is a lot of that. And so, I mean, it's a very in depth and difficult to explain answer, but on some level, I don't know, but for me, I personally kind of believe almost sort of the Joseph Campbell kind of style, where there are these archetypes, and I do think people fall into them, and sometimes they might be blended. And so I personally do think that there is a warrior archetype just as much as there is a healer archetype or an educator archetype. And they tend to just, I couldn't be, I could be an educator in some levels, but not to the extent that, some of the great educators or some of the great healers. I can connect people to ayahuasca, but I'm not a healer myself in terms of that sort of sacrifice and that sort of energy. And so I do think that people fall in that line. And so there's almost this weird separate world that when people are in combat, when they're in stress, like those sort of energies almost maybe like come alive, or that's probably a bad way of putting it, but like everything's simple in that sort of spot. Whatever brought you there when you're in this sort of combat scenario where, in I guess the situation where it's one side versus the other, almost like a World War II. There are people that I think are more built for that. And that just becomes like this very basic sort of thing. When we start making it, like within the case of the US, so I just want to establish that in my view, that I do think that I think that there are people that are built to be sort of like protectors or warriors or whatever society. And that's always been the case throughout human history. And, even if there's not a war, I think there are people that will like sacrifice themselves for the sake of the group. And I think personally, that's a very sort of noble side. What you happen in sort of the US and a lot of modern societies is that it kind of gets separated to where, and this I guess is always the case, where the politicians and the supposed country leaders are the ones that are voting on and making the decisions of where is a viable place to do this sort of use these soldiers that are sacrificing themselves for this cause. And on the hope, like if you're writing the story for Disney, the hope is that those are all aligned, that the politicians, actually want to spread democracy, whatever that means, or help out, this poor country or what have you. But, obviously that's not the case. It gets, grade, by monetary means, other means. There's a lot of deception there. And I think that what that causes is sort of a rift in society, a scar in society that I think has very long, unhealthy, resulting issues on that society. That will be hard to pinpoint to that, but I think it's overall that leads to sort of downfall or a much more unhealthy society when there's that much deception on why you're using people's basic instinct of what they believe that they're going through there,
and often
and so,
ruining their lives in the process.
Right, and then what we're dealing with is not allowing them or even preventing them from healing themselves on the tail end. And so I think you're already seeing that in the U.S. There's a growing divide across all sides, but especially the common people, politicians. Our Congress has been the lowest rating for a while, and then there's all the sort of stuff that you're seeing currently with the craziness going on there. But you really see it like after the Vietnam War, because there's a very sort of similar situation where there's just a tremendous amount of death, suffering, resulting mental issues because of the devastation that was done to the local Vietnamese, and just what they experienced of all that kind of stuff. And that led to a big societal rift going on afterwards, and directly led to a lot of this clash between different parts of society. And so I think if we're already seeing it, that we're likely to see it again. I think overall just deception on that level is very caustic for any sort of society to go for. And just in terms of what I see with veterans, it's a diverse group like anybody else, and those are just sort of my opinions. But you do have a lot of people that are so proud of what they're doing because they're representing this sort of long lineage of soldiers and warriors, and that is their personality, and they don't necessarily know how else to express it. But there are a lot of people that are just like, well, this is kind of bullshit. Like, why are we still in Afghanistan, or why are we still doing this? So there is, it's like any group, it's not 100%, but I have seen that.
Mm-hmm. So, the work that you've done with ayahuasca, one of the things my experience of ayahuasca seems to have brought forth to me is that it has a tendency to force me to grapple with the uncomfortable truths of myself, of my actions, of my behavior, viscerally. And I'm curious, as someone who, obviously you just expressed what your opinion is. You are cognizant of the deception, the deception and the misuse of military power, and the incredible sort of like mismanagement of veteran care on behalf of the sort of larger military. You are clearly aware of the consequences, referencing Vietnam, referencing like the trauma of the peoples inflicted by war on both sides. So you're aware of the consequences of the military industrial complex all around the world, right? And you've also had these ayahuasca experiences grappling with your own experiences in the military and war, as well as watching other people grapple with theirs. Has your perspective on the military and on war itself changed? And how did it change from before ayahuasca to after?
So I don't know for me if ayahuasca necessarily changed my perception on that. I originally joined the military on kind of more of the sort of philosophical context that I sort of outlined a little bit earlier on. And, I think still at this point, it would definitely be tricky. It'd take a little bit more, but I would still be inclined to do something similar in terms of express that side of me. And obviously giving what we know now about like all the wars and stuff like that, it would give me pause to go into that, but there would still be this sort of unfulfilled, you know, there is a way of being a soldier and being a part of something that is hopefully doing good. With ayahuasca and just all that sort of context, it hasn't really changed. I don't think it's really changed my mind on that global perspective, just because I don't necessarily think at this moment I have the ability, my power is on the local level. One, to help myself, and two, to help my community. And if it expands from there, then see where that leads me. You know, a lot of this sort of journey has taken a life of its own, and I would never have expected it to be where it is and with the implications that it does now. So I'm almost along for the ride and just trying to do what I can in the most responsible way. But on that side, you know, I think those are worthwhile discussions, and I'd be happy to be a part of it if I have some sort of direct control and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, the wheels keep turning whether or not I like it. And so right now I'm just trying to focus my energy on what I can change. And, you know, that's on the much smaller level, which I think will then have the ripple effects to the larger level. And if that expands to changing sort of the viewpoint and all that kind of stuff, then, you know, that's great. You know, I do think that having a little bit more, like, if we're going someplace because we need minerals, you know, that shouldn't be veiled in deception. That needs to be sort of the out there, and have a conversation on that. Like, does that make the people bad, or does that, like, what are the contexts of war? So I do think, like, on the higher level, policy does need to change, but on so many levels on our politics, it's just all about deception. It's just all about so many different, you know, people who are taking advantage of others for their own sake of getting reelected. I think that's really become highlighted in the past couple of years. So, I mean, you know, within my power circle, like, what I can do is help those veterans that come to me, and hopefully myself or one of them will have the ability to change things further down the line.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, insofar as, like, what kind of change can you affect in the sort of larger military industrial complex so as to be more aligned with, you know, your sort of idealistic sense of what the military could be, and the very real sense of what it presently is and how it's presently used, which seems to be only aligned with that idealistic sense in the hearts and minds of the soldiers who are being indoctrinated into that, even though that itself is being used as a way of deceiving them for the ends of people who are just ultimately caring about lining their pockets. And I think my question, I realized in hindsight, was the course of it was slightly confused. So I'm going to ask it again slightly differently.
Okay.
And it's something like, was there uncomfortable truths, goodness, about war and about the military and about yourself as a soldier that ayahuasca forced you to grapple with, that have changed your perspective on that in yourself, on those truths, whatever they might be?
No, I mean, no, for me, it never, and I haven't seen this with other veterans as well, and I didn't really see it with myself. Of, you know, there are some that might feel guilty or would not go back into their military service, but they tend to already have those sort of that inclination before going into the ayahuasca, and then the ayahuasca can provide help on the healing or help on the guilt for them, so that they're not necessarily carrying that burden. Because if we know from our past mistakes, you know, you want to be relieved from that, of you made the best decisions you could at the time, and that's what led to your life. For others, you know, they understood why they went in, and that was sort of the situation. And that's kind of always how I've been. You know, for whatever reason, it's made me to the person who I am. And there wasn't things in my service that I feel, you know, guilty about. And we could have that sort of argument on, you know, whether, you know, me actually being in, for instance, Afghanistan was unjust. Mm-hmm. But, you know, in that sort of context, like I said, when you're there, and again, whether or not you think we should be there, but when you are there, it is sort of almost a more basic thing where you are in pursuit of other people. There is this almost like chess match where there are clear sides, and like we said, there's the added collateral and all that kind of stuff. But we were, at that point, chasing down people who were, laying IEDs or killing, raping people in their village, and people who you could legitimately say are probably not the best people either. So I mean, there was sort of that clarity there, and again, that becomes a much more complex issue when you understand like the why are we there and all that kind of stuff. Do we have the right to be there? But on that sort of soldier kind of side, ayahuasca never made me feel guilty or wish I didn't pursue that. It's always kind of been more of like live in the present of like, this is who you are, and this is the skill sets you have, and this is what you can affect change in right now. And so, I feel like it's worthwhile considering, and it's worthwhile talking about. If we live too much in the past and are weighed down too much by guilt, we'll maybe change our minds in the future. But if we're weighed too much by guilt, then that prevents us from doing great things in the future.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that certainly, there's a certain degree of guilt and shame that is appropriate for this critical self-appraisal needed to make new changes. But there's also a degree to which it becomes toxic and creates the opposite effect in some way or another. And I asked that question, general curiosity, and also generally, I'm sure you've encountered this amongst veterans and in the larger sort of culture of psychedelics that you would obviously have to be somewhat abreast to, running the organization Heroic Hearts, which is that the sense that, that if you take ayahuasca, if you take psychedelics, it's going to fundamentally change you into being a different person. That there's this sense of like, it's going to make you more liberal. It's going to, whatever it is, it's going to turn you into hippie. It's going to so on and so forth. And some of that is stigma. Some of that maybe is the case. You might become more open, more receptive, more compassionate, more empathetic, but it isn't necessarily going to, this is the thing that more and more it's revealed, like it doesn't necessarily fundamentally alter your political views. And that's maybe an aside. There's a lot of discussion happening right now about, for example, the QAnon shaman and a number of sort of examples where psychedelics didn't exactly increase propensity towards liberal or democratic values or anti-war values or et cetera. And you can comment on that if you like. I don't necessarily feel like it's appropriate or necessary for you and I to dive down that. I don't really feel competent enough to talk about it all that intelligently, to be honest. But if you wanted to comment on that, you could. But otherwise, I have another question.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. I haven't seen in my own personal experience from the veterans I work with or the people that I've worked with that it fundamentally changes the core of who you are. People tend to be similar in a lot of ways. It might change certain negative behaviors, make you more open, maybe make you less neurotic, and maybe open a little bit more to change. But, I've met plenty of people who are still, I don't know if you're allowed to curse, but like assholes before and after, they've done plenty of ayahuasca ceremonies and they're still assholes. And so I personally kind of disagree, because I've heard Graham Hancock say that of like, if only politicians, they should be required to take it. I personally don't think it would fundamentally change a lot of stuff. And then you're going to have to dive into sort of the ego enhancing spiritualism side of that dynamic too, which gets more in the weeds of all this. So I don't know. I think we, in our own side, we just kind of have to, I think that a lot of that's projecting of like, this is the way to change everything in an easy sort of fashion. And there is not going to be an easy way, but we can help those that are seeking it.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I just want to echo, definitely. I mean, psychedelics can humble a person, but they also activate sort of pathological, psychotic levels of megalomania, as in, there are a handful of examples we could point to that are public people right now, still active, which I won't, because that's not the course of the podcast right now. There are places that are doing the name call outs. when we were having our sort of pre-interview discussion, when I was getting a sense of you, what you're doing, gearing up for this podcast, you had mentioned that one of the things that came up for you during your journey with ayahuasca was a connection to like the beauty and power of the natural world. When I'm looking at my note here, it was like the beauty and power of the natural world and a call to humility. And my question is something like this, and I think you sort of like kind of inadvertently answered it just a couple minutes ago, but I'm going to present it anyways, which is that, recognizing that just ayahuasca alone only exists because it comes out of the Amazon rainforest, this incredible ecology, an ecology that, from what I understand, is responsible. The microclimate it creates as the rainforest is responsible for like 40% of national rainfall in the United States, simply because of the the climate it creates around it. That out of this forest comes this thing that offered you an opportunity to transform your life, and to heal yourself and to heal a number of people who are your colleagues, your contemporaries, people whose lives are being devastated, by, the unintended consequences of what they felt was the right and good choice to do for themselves and for others, and the military industrial complex of the United States, the military of the United States is likely hands down the greatest devastator of ecological integrity on the planet right now. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts around that, in the sense that around whatever type of sort of trust or support or like allegiance you still have to a system that is presently significantly responsible to the eventual degradation and maybe perhaps destruction of this very environment, this very natural place that was the reason you were able to go through that healing, and was, from a deep spiritual point, the thing that humbled you back into a larger context of beauty. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, even on that, I think even sort of the uncontrolled capitalistic nature is a giant threat to the Amazon as well. There, obviously there's a lot of threats to it. And so even in the work that I'm doing, it has caused a sort of, ethical conundrum in a way of, if part of my mission is successful of providing more veterans access to ayahuasca, then that's going to put a strain on, the natural resources and all that kind of stuff. And, you saw this with sort of the cultural side of things and natural side in the 1950s when the mushroom tribes in Mexico got discovered, and it completely sort of destroyed the culture. You already kind of see this in Iquitos, where the sort of the economics, the capitalistic kind of system is
tourism,
changing it, and all that kind of stuff. And so there is that sort of dynamic along with sort of the destruction of the rainforest. But in my mind, and maybe this is a justification, but this is kind of what keeps me going, is that by us doing what we're doing and trying to keep it respectful and only working with places that are sustainable, and if we're able to kind of like outpace the rest of the race, then hopefully we have a little bit more of a impact in changing the narrative of, if it's just unfurled of how it will be, then it's going to play out the same way it's always going to play out, where, as ayahuasca gets more popular, the rich, you'll get like Hiltons and Iquitos, and they'll have their own Club Med style ayahuasca, and the rainforest is going to get devastated, especially with these plants and all that kind of stuff. But hopefully, if we become a little bit more prominent, maybe more of a thought leader than on our side, because our team has, we're trying to do it with the best intentions of like, hey, slow down. This is not the right way to do it. We need to be conscientious of all this kind of stuff. But also on the other side, I do, again, kind of think it is the answer I had before of, by helping sort of this community, then hopefully that does change sort of the bigger dynamic. Because what you're seeing on the local level, on the veteran side, is a lot of the things that appeal to people going into the military is they're already like had this sort of respect for nature. Like a lot of veterans are very already respectful for nature. They're very they're very, what do you call it, functional. Like they can build like little huts and houses. If you send them into the woods, they can take care of themselves. A lot of them hunt just to have a little bit more respect and connection to the meat, and will only hunt within the areas that they're allowed to. And so a lot of veterans like go back and they'd rather be in the woods and cities, or they become firefighters, or they, a lot of veterans, there's these organizations. One's called Task Force Blue, which is using veterans to clean up sort of the area, the waters around Key West and the beaches. Another one is in Africa, helping preserve sort of the endangered species. And so you have a lot of these veteran organizations that are doing that. And so I think by, bringing them into sort of the plant medicine and teaching them where it comes from, or connecting them where it comes from, connecting them to the source of it, and also these tribes that respect the source of it, I think you can bring them even more closer to nature and be some of the biggest advocates, be some of the biggest warriors. A lot of what we're trying to do is we have these warriors that, as we mentioned, are kind of displaced now because they no longer have that sort of combat style, but they still have that energy. And so we're trying to repurpose that warrior energy to either helping other veterans, or, for a lot of them, helping nature, going into that. And I think that's going to be the most powerful force of changing that sort of dynamic. If you have these people who know how the industrial complex works and then come back around, they're already informed by that. And, with the power of nature that healed them, come back around. And I think that's, one of the ways that can change.
Mm-hmm. And I totally see and respect what you're saying. And yet I didn't hear you speak at all there to the clear utility of also, if one cares about nature, obviously doing this local level stuff is incredible and very important and beautiful to hear that those are things that are happening. And yet, would one not be sort of, is it behooved, the word I'm looking for? Behooved to also protest military expansionism, given basically protest military spending, and given how much the military is a significant contributor to the very problems, that, and of course, you move towards capitalism very quickly. And obviously capitalism is, the military in the United States, probably all around the world, has now become sort of like the long wartime, the war arm of a capitalist agenda. And I think it's probably fair to say that. But would it not sort of behoove those coming out of the military, caring for the environment, to also sort of actively and directly protest military expansionism and military sort of investment as a way of also trying to protect nature? This is a very difficult question. Don't expect you to have a perfect answer here, it's a tough place to put you in.
I definitely don't have a perfect answer. No, not at all. It could behoove them. It's to each their own. They'll have to sort of make their decision. I brought up capitalism, that kind of stuff, because in terms of a marketing play, that's where our most intention go of what's happening in the Amazon of being burnt down for, the sake of purposing the land and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Whereas the military side doesn't get that much attention in terms of the direct impact on natural resources. So, mm-hmm. I just kind of moved to that because it doesn't get a lot of attention. I guess you can bring attention, but I just personally don't see a huge impact. And I also don't see people immediately going back to kind of going counter to the military, but as opposed to maybe changing it from within or changing it by other means. I've just never really seen a huge impact on just straight up protesting things, as opposed to finding avenues in your life that you can have a more direct impact, whether that is going into policy later in your life and having that direct change, or forming businesses or technology that then incorporate it. That's kind of how my mind works, where if you say like protests or doing all that kind of stuff, and I'm sure there's a lot of examples where it does work.
Well, I
But
mean,
for me,
the
I
civil
feel like a
rights
lot of
movement, the anti-war Vietnam movement, these are great examples. Fair enough. Presently, social protest, public unrest has gotten complicated with the capacity for governments to use military, although in the US they don't use military, they use militarized police forces to stomp down on protests and to control the narrative so that nothing actually can change. So fair enough, but there are absolutely examples.
there are examples, but even in the civil rights protests, like it's the protest was almost the expression, the afterwards. There's so much like work that was done, and before that, it wasn't just a lot of people deciding to protest. It was an active sort of campaign that had a lot of strategic sort of play and a lot of community. The reason why it was effective, the reason, like if you look at Gandhi's protests of why it was effective, we just see sort of the protests and what happened, like what's highlighted. But he did a lot of like community development and like helped out small businesses and had sort of this 3-tiered plan of how it was going to go out. And I'm just, in terms of, there is the time and place for it. I just don't see, a lot of better. I just don't see it happening. And in terms of sort of the energy, I feel like if we find ways where they can effectively do that or build up to when there is a time for protests, I think that is the sort of thought process that needs to happen of like, okay, this is the end outcome. This is what we're trying to change. We have these people that are coming out of the military that have a lot of energy and they hopefully are want to start businesses or start this or what have you. What are the most effective ways that we can get to this end state? And I feel like that is, for the way how I think that's the more productive way of thinking, or that's how I would personally pursue it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And thank you. And,
like
go ahead.
For instance, like with the whole, like with this ayahuasca sort of thing, is I hit sort of walls, and there's a lot of people that already sort of like attack the VA in different ways or go to the local, there's so many, in terms of what I'm doing, there's so many different ways to do it, whether run for politics or sort of protest more the VA or, call your local sponsors. For me, just the way I sort of see it is like, okay, well, this is what I can do immediately, kind of more direct action. And so, I'm sure there are different ways. It's just not how my mind connects to the straightest route there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Jesse, I know that I just hit you with some pretty big questions that are, they're divisive, and there's a lot of opportunity for commentary and difference on your perspective, on my perspective, between us and in the larger group. And I appreciate you attempting to tackle that incredibly difficult question. I'm going to try not to throw any more really giant sort of existential level questions at you, as if you would be able to answer them sufficiently enough to give us a way forward. But
it's all good. I mean, I feel like conversation is the key for us. I think what we need more is these sort of discussions. Is we come from probably a lot of different perspectives, but there's no reason we can't have an intelligent conversation together. And we might not agree at the end of it, but we're at least hopefully going to change our own minds a little bit by seeing what is possible on different perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. So thank you. I got one more difficult question, and then I'm going to ask you a little bit more about Heroic Hearts and what you guys are presently doing, and how people can learn more, how they can get involved, how they can reach out for your services. And it's something like this. Okay. So we've had a lot of discussion now, sort of recognizing how the, whatever sort of value on an archetypal level the military has for warrior type people, and it serves and should serve a definite purpose for strategically utilizing force to protect peace. I can get behind that. I think that is why I'm not anti-military. I am anti-unnecessary wars in every possible way. I'm not anti-military. I'm anti-obviously military expansionism, its destruction of environments. There's a lot of things about how the military is operating right now in the US in particular, that I'm extremely against, and a number of other places I'm against, but not the military as a thing. or the people within it as people caring for and attending to the larger potential purpose of that thing.
Mhm.
But we've talked quite a bit about how that's being misused, and it's being misused to, for the acquisition of power, of resources, and the acquisition of money, of course, money and power at great cost, financially, ecologically, and great cost on the people who are being used to sort of achieve those deceptive ends. And given the sort of almost malevolent, clandestine feel behind that type of deception, what do you think the possibilities are that the discovery of ayahuasca, I'll throw in here, so MDMA as well, to sort of be a cure for post-war or military-induced post-traumatic stress disorder, veteran PTSD, that doesn't fundamentally change their political views. So to justify, now if we can incorporate that, instead of turning down the war machine, we can keep ramping it up because now we can just fix our soldiers so that they're no longer an example by which we should probably stop doing the thing that we're doing. Do you think that there's a possibility that although on your end you're caring about people, you're caring about that kind of thing, that just like the hopefulness and the sort of like valor behind a person's reason to enter the military will be usurped for more deceptive and malevolent ends, and the cure for post-traumatic stress disorder becomes the cure for slowing down military expansionism?
Yes, I've actually been posed this question before, and I think it is an interesting sort of concept and way to take it. But in my mind, I don't think that's a big factor, because if you look at how the military has interplayed and just the pretty consistent amount of, like, even now, like the veteran suicide rate, it hasn't stopped in one bit. The fact that there is suffering, the fact that there is this huge rate of PTSD and even homeless vets and all this other kind of stuff, it hasn't turned down the war machine at all. So I have no reason to believe that the reverse is going to have the effect on it. At the end of the day, I think, again, this highlights one of the problems, is that those making the decisions are so separated from the results of their decision, or really just don't care. I think indifference is a big part of it. Is whether or not the tail end of what happens to the people that get churned out of it, I think has very little bearing. If it's a political year and, they can say that they support the troops and they get that, they might think that they do, but that's kind of what I've seen consistently. And again, the problem is that from the politician side and the civilian people, the politicians will say, hey, we support the troops. Look, I did this $1 billion bill to help suicide, help all the depression. And people are like, great, that's a great job. It's helping the troops. We did our part. They did their part. But then, like, where does $1 billion go? Is it actually having desired effects? Exactly. And at the end of the day, that's kind of the realm we're dealing with. Like, hey guys, like, I understand you're spending, like, the VA got $80 billion. And like I said, the suicide rate has only increased the past few years. So I don't know. I think the disconnect is kind of more of the issue. And I feel like in any case in the history, if you heal people and you give them a little bit different perspective in terms of what psychedelics can offer, I think it's only going to have a benefit. I don't think that there's going to necessarily, I don't see a lot of people taking this healing and this new purpose on life to come out the other end in this sort of context and be making the system worse. And the more we understand it, the more we can figure out, like you said, there are some bad personalities that come into play, but a lot of the people that I know, it gives them a new purpose on life. Like I said, you have this generational sort of stuff, so they might be more bonded to their family. And I don't know. I think on the local level, there's just a lot of good and a lot of beauty, and I can't necessarily see it having that negative effect. And no matter what, the military, it's a much bigger issue, and the military is going to churn it out no matter what. And you're already seeing that with, what's the biggest tool right now are drones, and it's just going to go more and more into that. So I think their solution already was just take people out of the equation more so. And, it's tricky, but I just, for whatever reason, and that no matter what, like, I have to do my duty and help guys that reach out to me. And I can't, if you showed me like this mathematical equation that did that, maybe it'd give me pause, but I can't turn down a person that's, looking to heal, looking to be helped.
I mean, it seems to me, it seems intuitively obvious that hurt people, suffering begets more suffering, and people suffering deeply from the mental health consequences of the harms that they've endured, whatever reason that might be, helping people through that in a way that allows them to become happier, healthier, and more generative contribution to their communities feels like, on the whole, likely a good idea. Maybe we could unpack some stuff there. There might be a lot. Any topic really can open up to a lot of discussion. But I see that, and again, I want to thank you for being receptive to a number of very difficult questions. So to
and yeah, just a little bit more too, if you like. There was something interesting that, with all the craziness of the U.S. political system and the race, and not going too deep into any of that because I don't want to at all. But you did see this sort of interesting thing where there's this weird Venn diagram meet where both sides, whether it was the people super on the Trump side or super on the Democrat side, were happy that we didn't go to another war, that we didn't go to a war with Iran, even if we were close. There was actually almost this weird agreement among both sides. And there was a weird disappointment that we weren't finally out of Afghanistan. That might filter out in terms of different groups. But I do think that there is, we've kind of been riding on this like endless war coattails without real purpose, and people are seeing the churning out. And who knows how much push that's going to have and how long it's going to last. But that was really the first time I saw that, where on a much more broad basis, people were like, thank God we didn't go to another war. Like this has been crazy. And so, hopefully that's the start of something. And hopefully, veterans can be sort of the voice of like, hey, there needs to be some reasonable, there needs to be some reason for this. It can't just be like, hey, we want to save some money on oil or what have you. So who knows, it's still too early, but I did see that and wanted to kind of bring that up.
Yeah. I mean, that's cool. I mean, kinetic warfare anyways, it seems clear that, the government and everyone else are still participating, like all countries are still participating in covert sort of digital warfare. I don't know what the exact word is, but like hacking and manipulating. Even Canadian CSIS just came out saying that, that Canadian industries all across the board have been like significantly jeopardized by state actors, primarily from Russia and China, who are attempting to infiltrate and dismantle. And that type of warfare will continue, as will, the multi-level narrative warfare biting for the ideological allegiance of the people towards, whatever serves the people backing the narrative warfare. But that's a huge discussion. Obviously, that's not what we're here to do for. I mean, if you want to talk to that, you could. But otherwise, I have a couple sort of closing questions about heroic arts.
Yeah, we'll leave that discussion for another time.
Great. So heroic arts, what are you guys doing right now? Pardon me. What is your organization doing right now? Especially given, the pandemic has complicated getting people anywhere, moving them from place to place, but especially, down to Peru or Costa Rica or whatever. So what is Heroic Hearts presently doing, and how can people get more informed and get more involved, be it involved in what you're doing or involved as a recipient of your services?
Yeah, of course. I mean, in terms of the involvement, heroicheartsproject.org is the website, and that's where the information is. For veterans that are interested, there's a sign up application. And then once they fill that out, there's a wait list, and we send out updates. There's also an ambassador program for people who want to volunteer time or expertise that they can sign up there, and obviously all the normal social media. What we're doing right now is similar to a lot of other organizations, just trying to figure out what's the planning in the unplannable time frame that is COVID. But it does look like there is starting to be a light at the end of the tunnel. Spot that we've worked with in Costa Rica has been running a few retreats. We're hoping for Peru to open up a little bit. We've been exploring options domestically there's certain churches that are doing good work. Places like Oregon are very interesting. So we're going to be doing a lot of investigation there where people can actually partake in psilocybin and communal, ceremonial, and even therapeutic offices. So definitely looking into that. And same thing in Canada. There's a lot of initiatives to increase access to psilocybin and some other substances. So, ketamine therapy, I know it's not organic, but it has been shown to be very effective for people with suicidal ideations, depression, and you can use those. And there's clinics, there are great clinics there in Canada and the US. So just looking at whatever tools are available to sort of, stem the suffering of the veterans, especially the suicide crisis. So just trying to tackle it on all sides of, okay, what can we do right now? What can we do in the future? And then in the meantime, just sort of using what is the silver lining of the slowed down operation speed to fortify what we're doing and make sure we are doing it better so that we are able to hit the ground running once things go full force. So, we've been fortunate in that we have been able to expand branches, like I said, in Canada and the UK, and they're all doing some great stuff. We have an ayahuasca study going on. We have a psilocybin study that's being developed right now, and just trying to look at different dynamics of how ayahuasca, affects somebody therapeutically and also physical metrics like gut microbiome, possibly inflammation markers, all that kind of stuff. So, it's a very uncharted territory. And so it's just trying to figure out like, okay, what's the best next steps?
Great. And to repeat again, that URL that people want to go to is
heroicheartsproject.org, and just look up Heroic Hearts Project on Instagram, Facebook, and you'll find us pretty easily.
Great. Jesse, thanks so much for being on the show. I respect and appreciate what you're doing with your organization to the extent to which I understand it. And I appreciate you volunteering your time here today. So thank you very much.
James, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed the discussion. Like I said, I think having these hard discussions, these more in-depth questions and answers is the way that we can all figure out the best way forward.
Great. Thank you. And cut. Okay. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, this show was recorded February of 2021. So the things that Heroic Hearts Project is doing have probably evolved and expanded since then. So do head to heroicheartsproject.org to check them out and see what they're up to. Or if you are in a situation where you'd like to access their services, that's where you would go to get more information. You could also follow them on social media. Links to all of that are contained in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com. And if you found value in this episode, please drop me a tip as a one-time donation, or if you're finding value in this show and you are in a place to financially contribute to the production of the show, to my ability to earn an income while putting full-time hours into this show, please become a patron on Patreon. Patreon.com/JamesWJesso, Jesso. And nonetheless, thanks for tuning in, watching, or listening all the way to the end, and I will see you on the next episode. Take care.